shopping to the marketplace in Kharkiv, the second largest Ukrainian city, mostly Russian-speaking. My grandparents come from a rural area, and as it often happens in Ukraine, they understand Russian, but cannot actually speak it. So in some cases, my mom would act as a translator. My grandmother wanted to buy one pants in one of the stores, and approaching the seller, she started speaking Ukrainian because she feels more comfortable. And Russians usually understand Ukrainian as well because languages have some similarities. However, she was ignored. At first, we thought that the seller couldn't hear her or was occupied with something, but the woman wouldn't answer until my mom interrupted in Russian. The woman turned out to be simply rude, unwilling to recognize my grandmother just because of the language she spoke. Experiencing it at the age of 8 made me feel confused, offended, but it also triggered me to think, why in Ukraine I couldn't approach people with Ukrainian? After that situation, I would fear speaking Ukrainian in Kharkiv. I would fear speaking there in general because each time I did so, my Ukrainian accent would be heard and my mom would correct every second word I say. That's how I learned Russian. On the UWCSEA official website, it is stated that our college celebrates linguistic diversity by having over 80 languages spoken by members of its community, students, teachers, staff, as their first language. But I wonder how many of these can a single person speak? In fact, how many of them a single UWCSEA student knows? I'm fascinated being here and living in such a diverse multilingual environment. There is no doubt knowing several languages is considered beneficial in our society. It increases your intellectual abilities, it boosts your chances of getting a hiring position in a prestigious company, or it serves you as a tool when guiding a stranger from abroad. However, is it always so? Does being bilingual, trilingual, or multilingual always benefits you personally, or more, the whole community? And finally, what impacts does it have when, being multilingual, you choose to speak one language over another one? Today, I want to tell you the story of Ukraine, Ukrainian language, and most of all, Ukrainian people, with the consequences of their daily language choices. Ukraine is a beautiful country with its unique culture and traditions. It has a Slavic origin and strong ties with other Slavic nations, all together coming from an ancient tribal union, Kievan Rus, existing in 9th-13th century. That was the place where most Slavic languages appeared and later on spread throughout the European continent. Ukrainian was developing as one of them. However, it never had a chance to become prominent, widely recognized or used. It happened as throughout the centuries, Ukraine has been split up between powerful empires and states who were trying to assimilate Ukrainians by targeting the thing which made them different, their language. For example, in 1789, the Polish Sejm parliament ordered to close all Ukrainian schools in Western Ukraine and commanded Polish language to be used there instead. Or in the 19th century, Austro-Hungarian Empire even tried to replace Ukrainian Cyrillic alphabet with a Latin one. But the amount of prohibitions and restrictions coming from West, meaning Ukrainian lands ruled by Poland, Austria, and Hungary, cannot be compared with the amount of those coming from Russian side. Since the times of the Russian Empire, when in 1863 it was prohibited to ban all Ukrainian educational literature, the restrictions reached their pinnacle in the times of the USSR. It happened when in 1933, Stalin signed a document about the threat of Ukrainian language and started a period of so-called executed renaissance, a generation of Ukrainian artists, poets, and writers killed by Stalin's command. Almost 30,000 intellectuals were arrested, deported, or executed. One of the main slaughters happened in 1937 in Russian north region of Karelia, where the most prolific and progressive Ukrainian artists have been killed. They are portrayed on this picture. In the decades following 1933 resolution, the majority of universities in Ukraine taught exclusively in Russian. Highly ranked job position and official positions were available only to Russian speakers. And limitations and prohibitions like this continued throughout the whole history of the USSR, when in 1972 the Communist Party established an official course and proclamation of a new historical era of Soviet people, thus establishing a course of denationalization. Or when in 1983 they decided to increase the salaries of Russian teachers, thus promoting Russification. Consequently, when the USSR fell apart, Ukrainian language and its usage hit rock bottom, with almost 30% of Ukrainians speaking pure Russian. The others, dialects and mixes with other languages. That was the state of national language when country became independent in 1991. Ukraine proclaimed itself to be a country to be ruled based on democratic principles. Very much Western and unknown at the time's idea of not only freedom of speech or accessible traveling abroad, but also the society's ability to govern itself by choosing its authorities. And that's when the language you speak comes into play. I want you to pay attention to the following maps. This is ethno-linguistic map of Ukraine. Here we may see mostly Ukrainian part, which is represented by orange color, and predominantly Russian-speaking part. So this is how Ukrainians were distributed. I want you to imagine a citizen of a new-born country. You have been just given an ability to vote for a bunch of recently appeared political parties. You don't have profound knowledge of politics. You don't really understand the difference between political populism, extremism, or centrism. You have to vote because you need to choose your president and your government. And it's worth mentioning that the most accessible resources of information would probably be either TV or radio broadcasting, or your close friends and relatives. And one thing uniting both of them is language. These are the election polls of Ukrainian elections of president in 1994, 2004, and 2010. A clear pattern may be noticed. And it not only depends on the language prevalently spoken in the region, but on the language of candidates themselves. For example, in 2004, one of the candidates, Viktor Yanukovych, was leading his campaign in Russian, thus receiving a very small support in western region of Ukraine, and vice versa. According to statistical analysis of a vote, the electorates of Ukrainian candidate, Ukrainian-speaking candidate, were strikingly different, both linguistically and ethnically, and consisted of 2/3 of Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians, 17% of Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and only 6% of ethnic Russians. Throughout its history, Ukraine has been swinging between pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian governments. And as a result, Ukrainians have had very unstable political and economical life. It also impacted Ukraine on the international arena, because Ukraine has always been perceived as somewhere in between. And as long as we manage to maintain both good relationships with Russia and Europe, nothing seemed to be a threat. But everything changed in 2013. The pro-Russian president government at the time refused to sign the Ukrainian-European Association Agreement, leading to first students and then all national uprisings and protests throughout all the country. At that point, it didn't really matter if it was in eastern or western Ukraine, because suffering from economic stagnation, corruption, and abuse of power, Ukrainians clearly realized the benefits of moving towards West, towards the European Union. As the protests were becoming more widespread and more violent, they led to a fast-paced chain of historically significant events. Today, this period is called the Revolution of Dignity, a moment when Ukrainians clearly established their political preferences and direction. The events of the time included drastic inflation, government collapse, and Russian military invasion. But why would the troops be sent to invade a sovereign country? How Russia would justify its invasion? Language. Russian government would deny its fear of losing Ukraine from its economical and political orbit. Instead, it would use manipulation and propaganda to justify its occupation of eastern Ukrainian region called Donbass, along with the annexation of Crimean Peninsula. And frankly speaking, there were some people in this region supporting the appearance of Russian government, but it still remains a breach of an international law and an effective instrument to pull back Ukraine's economy, thus preventing it from integration into the European market. As one of the main responses to a military invasion, new Ukrainian government issued a bunch of so-called language laws, which would restrict the amount of Russian used on national TV, force all Russian teaching schools shut down, and make all public events and official meetings be conducted solely in Ukrainian. These new regulations provoked a big controversy, because on one hand, they were Ukrainian speakers, and part of Russian speakers who believed in this idea, as they thought that it would promote the amount of those affected by Russian peace. But on the other hand, there were Russians who were complaining that they were being marginalized and forced to give up their usual language habits. As a result, Ukrainians have been confronted with their languages again. But it didn't last for a long time. Exactly a month ago, at 5 a.m., Ukrainians woke up to the sounds of exploding bombs in their major cities. The whole world woke up, astonished by another war. Justification from Kremlin? Special military operation to protect Russian-speaking citizens of Ukraine from genocide organized by Kyiv, with the aim of demilitarization and denazification. That's what Russian citizens heard on their national TVs when a maternity hospital was bombed in Mariupol, a city with 90% of Russian-speaking population. While in various flats, residents and apartments were bombarded in Kharkiv, almost entirely Russian-speaking city, and located just 50 kilometers away from Russian border. It feels horrible and unbearable to see the streets of your native town destroyed and in debris. It feels terrifying to see your friends fleeing their homes, unaware if they would ever come back. But after a period of mental shock and distress, I started wondering about the possible causes which could have led to such a catastrophe. I realized the power of a single word. The power of everyday choices Ukrainians have been making consistently. Each time Ukrainian would choose to speak Ukrainian, they would unconsciously and indirectly contribute to Vladimir Putin's hegemonic idea of Russian-Ukrainian union. They would contribute to his detestable justification of the war he's been supporting for 8 years already. And it's true that due to various reasons, Ukrainian language has been vastly assimilated. But isn't it a personal responsibility to speak a national language in order to prevent the possibility of a war? I can speak both Russian and Ukrainian. I like Russian classic literature. I adore reading Russian poetry because it is no better or worse than Ukrainian. I feel grateful to my mom for having taught me Russian because now I can communicate with people from all over the world, even here in UWC. But since the beginning of the war, I cannot listen to Russian music the way I used to. Each time doing so, my eyes start filling with tears. Each time reading information on my phone in Russian, I start questioning myself. Why do I keep allowing myself to remain in a Russian-speaking social bubble, considering the atrocities this language brought about in my country today? My life in Singapore spares me from making this choice, as we use English in our day-to-day lives. But what I wonder is what will happen to me and all the Ukrainians when we come back to our country, renewed, liberated, prosperous. But what I wonder even more is what will happen to you when you leave this room. Which way will the butterfly flutter when you choose to speak the language you speak?